I'm going to turn a light
on. And we are good to go. All right, so I guess I can get us started here. So thank you for joining us in our kind of lightning fast presentation on designing an inclusive course. And so we're actually going to follow up this session with another brief session on maintaining an inclusive course environment. So you're welcome to stay tuned for that as well. All right, so one of the first, parts of creating a course is, of course, thinking about our syllabus, and to really do so in a way that's welcoming. So some of the kind of types of syllabi that achieve this include a promising or invitational syllabus.
We should know that this came from Ken Bain, and I don't remember if you were at Ken Bain's presentation, but this was one of the things that really got his name established as a leader in teaching and learning.
The idea of the promising syllabus.
Which he now calls an invitational syllabus.
And certainly just not treating that syllabus like it is a legal contract, right? Using big questions to provoke curiosity, talking about what got you interested in the discipline and inviting students to ask those questions themselves. Explaining how course activities are necessary to answer those questions, and creating student-centered course policies. So in this way, really providing students all of those resources, but showing kind of that pedagogy of care that we've been talking about in every part of our syllabus.
And yeah, one thing that we keep hearing is this notion of syllabus day or syllabus week, which is a concept I hadn't really heard of until recently, but it seems to be a bit of an epidemic that follows a pandemic here. One of the worst things you could do on the first day of class is to spend the whole day going through the details of the syllabus, especially if it's going to be in the form of a legal document with all these thou shalt nots. Most of students' impressions of the course and of you as an instructor are formed actually in the first few minutes of the class, but certainly in the first day. And there's a lot of research on that. And one of the worst things you can do is bore students to death on the first day. The first day is a time when you really should try to engage the students, connect to the students, get them interested in the discipline, get them interested in the class, and focusing on those big questions about why they should care about this course, what it's going to do for them. That's that notion of the promising syllabus, and inviting them to join in the conversation. And if we can use that first day to do that, we're going to be in a much better position for the whole rest of the term. So doing things that are interesting, engaging, raise some big questions, ask them questions, get them to respond, get them thinking about the issues they're going to engage in. Share the syllabus with them, but don't spend the whole day just going through it
line by line.
Line by line. And I hate it when people say syllabus day, and I just get horrified when people talk about syllabus week, which was a term I first saw on the Oz Professors Hangout recently.
Wow.
Oh,
yeah, that was the main point. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah, that's another good point, right? To provide a sample of course activities. So if you're going to be, using a lot of small group discussions, to get right into it and, really explain to the students, the purpose of that, and, get them comfortable with each other, with you as the professor, and going through some of those activities together.
And raise those big questions, but then talk also about how you're going to help them address it. Talk about the things in the syllabus, but don't have them refer back to the syllabus or go through it line by line. Talk about what you'll be doing what they'll be doing in the course all through the semester, and give them some examples of it and explain to them how this is essential in order to be able to answer those big questions, or to address those issues that you want, or to achieve the skills that you want them to achieve by the end of the term.
And so, I guess kind of along this point is thinking about that very first contact that you have with your students. And typically this is probably before you even step into class. So if you are sharing your syllabus or you are, writing a welcome email or an announcement, consider a welcome video, consider doing this a week or so before class begins, so that,
Or even the night before,
or even
if
the
you
night before,
procrastinate
right?
like many of us do.
Never.
Just, give students that idea that you are thinking about them, that you are thinking about this course, that you've put a lot of time and consideration into this course, and that you're excited to be there with them. Share appropriate information about yourself in a way to humanize yourself to students. It can be very intimidating for students to walk into the class and be seeing you for the very first time. So to make sure that you are talking about your own struggles and how they might identify with those similar struggles, and encouraging them of their abilities to overcome any challenges they might face in the course. So this could be why the course is interesting to you, why you believe it's important. And I'll let John.
Sharing some excitement with them is good. And one of the helpful thing to do from the very beginning is to include growth mindset messaging. Let students know that you believe that your students will be successful, that the course will be challenging. Avoid the word rigor, because that's generally a sign that you're trying to weed people out. And for most people, that's not the goal. If that is your goal, you may want to think about some other sort of employment, but let them know that it's going to be challenging, but they learn the most when they're challenged. A good analogy is video games, that if a game is really easy, people don't play it very long. If it's too difficult, or there's not supports or ways to make it achievable, they're going to give up along the way. We want the course to be challenging because that makes it interesting, and remind them that, the things they often find most engaging and most interesting are challenging, but the challenges are going to be feasible. Let them know that they'll be able to achieve it, and that you'll be providing them with the support needed to let them achieve those goals. And, talk about the course materials you're providing, the activities they'll be doing, and how that will help work towards achieving the goals and the skills that you want them to acquire by the end of the class.
And I'll just mention that Kristen has done a really wonderful workshop on promoting growth mindset in your syllabus earlier this week. And so that is another workshop to definitely go back and view that recording. Which is
Tuesday at 11, I think it was, wasn't it?
I think you are correct. Tuesday at 11. So you can head over to that, to the CEL website, and you can see the recording there. But she does a really good job kind of explaining what the language might look like in a course that is promoting growth mindset versus one that is not.
And another interesting thing that she had mentioned, and this was actually someone we interviewed on the podcast a couple of times, Elizabeth Canning has done a lot of research on that. And one of the things she's found is that instructor's mindset is at least as important as student mindset. And if the instructor believes that their students won't be able to achieve, then students will pick up on that, and we'll see some really large gaps in performance, which are tied to the usual sources of stereotype threat and so forth. But when instructors do believe that students are capable of learning by working through materials and, with adequate supports, students end up doing much better. And the achievement gaps that we observe, or the equity gaps that we observe, are dramatically smaller. And in some cases, they disappear or nearly disappear.
Another consideration is to think about the cost of our course materials. So if you were attending the seminar on the Student Success Symposium on Monday, one of the surveys that students take talked about the financial stress that students are feeling. And we had a large proportion of our students experiencing some significant financial stress and burdens in their life. And so one way to design your course to be inclusive of all students, particularly those who are struggling, which is, again, a very significant portion of our students, is to keep our costs as low as possible. So, to consider OER or adaptive and personalized learning software that is free or inexpensive. Using inclusive access if you cannot find any kind of appropriate open educational resources.
And with inclusive access, students have that as part of it's basically they're getting e-copies of the text built into the learning management system, and they get first day access, because the last thing you want to do is to restrict the access of students who already often come in with weaker educational backgrounds because they can't afford to buy a textbook or sign up for the systems that you use. And whatever you do, avoid those surveillance systems, which are really expensive and ineffective.
Kind of continuing and thinking about the course materials that we use, you know, there are a lot of resources out there for decolonizing our syllabi. So thinking about, you know, who is leading various disciplines, or who is considered to be leaders in disciplines and is deciding what is important in those discipline specific fields. And, you know, to really think about expanding not only the content of your course, but also the scholars and authors that you rely on in your course, so that you are including more diverse perspectives and examples. Also acknowledging, right, when relevant, the systemic exclusion of some voices in your discipline. So you know, I do this often in early criminological theory discussions, where there are a lot of racial and gender bias built into the structure of, you know, various theories. And so, you know, really calling out those limitations in our disciplines and talking about, you know, what would, you know, how that kind of decision making to focus on those problematic foundations of our disciplines, you know, can be quite exclusive of people.
So if people aren't represented, let them know that you're aware of that, and that's an issue that should change. Just acknowledging that can be useful.
All right, so also, you know, embracing diversity as an asset in our course. So being very explicit about that, you know, setting expectations for valuing diverse viewpoints right at the very beginning of class, within that first day, right, within those first conversations that you're having with students, making sure that your language is inclusive. So, you know, not using language like mankind, but humankind, or something that is not, you know, segregating certain groups of people as others. Share your gender pronouns. So whether students are comfortable disclosing their gender pronouns is something we should leave to them. But by sharing your own gender pronouns, that might signal to students that this is a place where you are concerned and want and care about using appropriate language
and about their own identities
and their identities.
And one of the things that's really helpful is to gather some information about your students. And one thing you could do is you could use a survey within the learning management system, or use a Google form. And there is a survey that was put together by the authors of the book that we read last semester. Tracy Addy and a few others were the authors of that, which is a who's in class form, just to gather some information about composition of your class, in terms of what their interests are, in terms of their identities, in terms of any concerns that they may have, in terms of whether they're first gen status or not, in terms of what their background may be in your discipline. There's a lot of things you might want to ask, but the main thing is to gather information from your students that you can use to help them make connections, so that if you find people really, for example, in music, if you find people really interested in a certain type of music, you might be able to make some connections. Or if they have some sort of a background that's relevant, you can try to use those things to help bring them into the class and help them feel more part of the conversation, and also let them know that you know about them, and that's a signal that you do care about them a bit. Now, one of the questions is whether you do this anonymously or not, and the answers are very mixed. And perhaps the best solution is to do a mix of things. One is to gather some anonymous data for things that students might not feel comfortable sharing with you or with the class. But you may also want to let them share some things with the rest of the class, either in introductions in person, if it's a face-to-face class, or introductions on a discussion board, if that's more comfortable, or if you don't have time to do that during the class session, or if it's an online class. So there's advantages of doing it anonymously, and there's also some disadvantages, because often it really helps to get to know the individual students, and the anonymous survey gives you some general information about class composition, but not much more than that. But that introductory discussion can be really a useful way of doing it, where it is public, and students will form connections when they hear other people with similar interests or similar backgrounds, even if they're from the same region of the state. That will often help establish connections and help them to get to know each other a bit better.
Another really important thing we can do is learning names. And this doesn't mean that you have to put a lot of pressure on yourself to memorize students' names, especially if you are teaching large lectures.
300 or 400 students.
Right, 300 or 400 students, as John does on a regular basis. But you can use table tense, right? And calling students by their names. And you know, I've talked to several people throughout this week who are using table tense. They, you know, going the extra step to get them laminated so that they have longevity in their classes. And you know, it's a really great way to you know, make students feel welcome, because you are calling them by name. So even if you don't have that memorized, there are, you know, good ways that you can you know, still use their names and make that experience more personalized. Learning student pronouns, again, if this is provided by the student. So, you know, to be careful about requiring disclosing that information if students aren't comfortable with that. But if students are openly providing that information to you, and again, if you are providing your pronouns, that might signal to them that they are welcome to do that as well. But using those pronouns, if provided by the student, is another important aspect of addressing them. Also learning pronunciations, right? So it can be, you know, kind of intimidating if you come across a name that you're not familiar, or a particular pronunciation that you are unsure of. So having students share audio clips in a form or on a Flipgrid. We actually have a presentation on Flipgrid coming up later this afternoon. And so there are a lot of different ways you can get those pronunciations available to you when you are using students' names.
And you could even just create a Google form to collect them, have them record an audio file on the phone and upload it in the form.
All right, so our sort of last point here is to consider universal design principles. So providing students with multiple means of representation, so different ways that they can acquire knowledge, multiple means of engagement that allow them to showcase their interests, increase motivation, and offer feasible challenges, right? Desirable difficulties. And finally, multiple means of expression, giving them alternative ways to demonstrate knowledge. So building this right into your course, right from the beginning, you know, gives students a lot of different ways they can showcase their knowledge, and ways they can, you know, continue their learning throughout your course. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what we have.
So yeah, so now we'll open it up.
Yeah, we have a minute or so.
Any things you'd like to add, or any suggestions or concerns?
I was just wondering, I don't know what surveillance.
Oh, those remote proctoring software things, which are incredibly expensive, which are completely ineffective because they're easily broken, and there's videos that students can watch to learn how to get past them. And yet it raises the cost by, in some cases, like $20 per exam for students. And it also excludes students who do not have the hardware that's needed to work. So it's something that pretty much every teaching center in the country discourages, and it's something that many colleges and universities have banned, and I wish we were one of them.
Okay. And what about, so I have not gotten up to speed on OER, and I know that there's all sorts of resources on the library's webpage, but you know, I've already put my book order in for my class. I am concerned that it's going to be a barrier to some of our students. You know, is it too late to make that change for the fall? Probably, right?
I don't think it would be.
I think you could change it. I'm one of those delinquent people who don't provide my textbook stuff until the very last minute, but I've made a commitment in my classes now to not use textbooks or any kind of, I just rely on free and open source material now, but I don't think it's too late at all.
Yeah,
So,
and no student would complain to go from a more expensive book to something that's less expensive if you can find something.
right. So is your recommendation to go through the library and
Well, you could also go to the SUNY OER Services webpage. They have a guide to resources there. Let me see if I can find that. It's really nice, and Lumen anything that's available from Lumen Learning is free. I'm not sure what they have in music.
Right.
They in many disciplines they do. There we go. Yeah, if you could just drop that into the chat. Do they have?
Yeah, this is what happens. You don't see. Well, I guess we consider it a humanities.
So yeah, so if you click on humanities, it might be. There might be something. I know they have a lot in languages and history, but you can search.
You can look, search for music theory.
Yeah. Isn't there a search? Yeah.
Okay,
and it's kind of empty, but you could always do a Google search for music theory, OER, or free textbook. But with inclusive access, if you sign up for that, students get the book right in the learning management system. If in many cases it costs half or less, sometimes it's like 20% of the cost of a textbook, and it's entirely and students get access to it on the first day, because when students have to wait for 2 or 3 weeks to come up with the money to buy their books.
Oh, I know. That was a problem back in the day when I was still in the classroom. So I know it's only gotten more so.
It's gotten dramatically worse, and many students simply don't buy books, and and they're the students who are most at risk in any case. Right.
Okay. Thank you.
But the library has some good resources on it, but unfortunately with OER, because it's free, there's no one out there selling it or pushing it or coming around to our
no advertisement.
And offering free demos of things. But
okay, well, I can do a search. That seems reasonable.
Any other?
I think Magdalena and I share the distinction of teaching classes that people tend not to be super enthusiastic about. Music theory is kind of the math of the music world, and so it's often not everyone's favorite course. Of course, I'm a geek and I love it. But
introductory microeconomics might be up there.
It might be up there too. But yeah, trying to engage them and why they have to learn this is always fun. So. But I always do an exercise the first day where I take a student out into the hallway and I like sing a little melody in their ear. And then I have one by one, I have the students come. So they play the telephone game essentially. So they see like where it started, and I know where it started. I play it on the piano at the end. And at the last person, sings it back, and it is completely different, which makes the argument for this is why we need to learn how to write it down.
Yes.
Great.
All right.
Okay.
Very useful. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.